I think, Steve, this one would probably go to you. And it reads as, how would a cloud-based system uptime be maintained through an IP provider with aggressive firewall protection so that the current incidents and situations could be addressed timely over the internal network when the cloud is not accessible? This came from Terry Petford.
Okay, so that's, I want to break that into two questions. First of all, let's talk about the network component. In a campus-based network, you really should be looking at how you can make your network more resilient for all of your users, not just the video users. So, that really comes down to building resiliency into the network. It's a critical component. If the cloud structured network has degraded performance, it'll do some management of the available bandwidth. That's a great feature. But it's incumbent upon us that our network builders to also build those resilient networks. So what do you need? It's pretty simple. You need to have multiple paths so you don't get caught by a backhoe and your line gets sliced up. So you need to, on a campus, have multiple input points to the network. You need to have network electronics that supports that in a redundant fashion. And you need to have the infrastructure in the form of power and cooling that supports those pieces. So the first part is just as good network protocol outside of network security, you need to be thinking about that. The second part is the firewall component. The cloud structure stuff supports HTTPS, which should be being passed across most networks anyway without any firewall modification. So that's a good thing. The second part is, since you're doing this store and forward mechanism, you're not taxing the firewall, right? It's something that when we build the networks and you compare hosted versus cloud-based, hosted versus in-house, you don't really think about the extra burdens you're putting on your firewall by taking everything and streaming it across your network. So in this case, your firewall component probably doesn't need to change. The protocol, one of the standard protocols that you use, and the streaming timing is not that critical.
And one thing I'll add to that is this kind of assumes that all of your responsibilities are served by one ISP or one broadband connection. Again, with multiple outbuildings, et cetera, it's a nice in the cloud model that any building that's got connectivity is uploading, and anyone can get online can get to that video, regardless of what's going on in one spot or another.
I see, thank you, Steve and Rick. I see another question coming down. This question is from Danielle, and it reads, how do you implement using existing camera systems? Can you use existing cameras? And I see another question which is basically addressing the same topic, and the person's asking if we could utilize old analog cameras, or would they need to kind of, buy new IP cameras to be used with the cloud storage service?
Yeah, so camera takeover, excuse me, camera takeover is very common. The cameras tend to last longer than computers, for example. There's a lot of old analog cameras out there that still work, and it costs a lot to replace them. For analog cameras, you just need to get what's called a video encoder or a video server. It's got one or more coax inputs on one side and an Ethernet jack on the other, and that'll take the analog cameras and turn them into a virtual network camera. And there's even rack mount ones from Axis where you can, it's a blade type system, 4 analog cameras per blade, I think 10 blades per chassis, so you can put 40 analog cameras into 4U of rack space, or the conversion of 40 analog cameras into 4U of rack space. You can really do high density takeovers of analog cameras. For network cameras, yes, with some caveats. The cloud structure system can support almost, excuse me, almost any kind of network camera. We're only looking for a motion JPEG stream from each camera. We kind of ignore the loss tier encoding that they're trying to do in that small micro that's on board. So that's a very common feature set that we can usually get a hold of. Now for some lower end network cameras, they only support one stream, which means if you're recording at 640 by 480 and someone views the camera on their phone at 320 by 240, you've just changed the recording to a lower resolution than what you're hoping to get. So we encourage people to get cameras that can support at least 2 streams, if not more, just for this usage model, if nothing else. But yeah, generally speaking, we can take over pretty much any digital camera and any analog camera.
So I'll just add to that. So we've done implementations, and there's a little bit of technology hat that I wear, but also wear this business hat. I'm sure some people caught some of my comments earlier about how budgets go, how to budget for this. So we've got a site that's got a little over 7,000 cameras, and they're all analog cameras, right? And to move that from an infrastructure standpoint, even if you had the budget to do that, is just a monumental physical task. So the customer came up with a game plan to basically quarter by quarter start to move off of their analog cameras onto IP cameras. But that required a whole infrastructure upgrade along the way. So they're tracking out about 500 cameras per quarter that they're moving. So that's a pretty big process for them to move from that 7,000 at 500 at a cut. It's still a big undertaking. They get some advantages, as Rick said, as they move through the the cutover, but they still maintain those cameras, and they pick those cameras based on ease of cut and also based on ones which were most critical, where they needed multiple streams or PTC capability and what have you. So that kind of blending does work out well, and the back-end infrastructure could be incrementally applied to the environment.
There's one more question. In fact, there was a bunch of questions around the same topic, around having an NVR and trying to kind of move over to the cloud storage. But let me specifically address this. The question coming from Sridhar, who's on the call today, and he's asking, do you provide SaaS offering, or do we need to get our own cloud storage? So this one I can answer that we do provide the SaaS offering, and we also provide the cloud storage as well. But the other question that he has is that he has an NVR, and can he connect to a CVR to take advantage of the cloud storage? So you may want to address that.
Yeah, we have done some deployments where an NVR stays on site in parallel with the CVR. Sometimes it's just handy that the NVR has already been bought and paid for. Sometimes there's no reason to turn it off. I think it's an analog deployment where you just put T-connectors on the coax cable, and you've got a parallel system going that pushes to the cloud. I've seen it in digital deployments where you've got a network camera that can support more than one stream. One goes to NVR, one goes to CVR. So you have on-site storage and off-site storage, kind of like wearing suspenders and a belt. It's a little bit of overkill, but if you have an extreme need for reliability, you could look at the cloud solution as an off-site backup solution in that regard. And it makes for a fully redundant system.
And another related question to that question that Sridhar had raised, and it reads as, we have an existing NVR in one of the buildings supporting 15 to 16 cameras. How can we enable remote access to the feed? Does CloudStructure support that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest thing to do would be to put a CVR at that building, have it record from those cameras, and push them to the cloud. Then wherever you are, as long as you have broadband connection and a browser, you can get to that video. And that'll be with no port forwarding the router or holes in the firewall or anything else you would normally need to do on site.
So let's just think about that just a little bit from a campus perspective. I just want to dive down into something, because I think that one of the areas that I touched on was personal security of faculty and staff. There's no reason why the campus police should not be carrying smartphones or tablets and be able to reach the cloud via off-network connectivity. So in other words, 3G or 4G access, and be able to look at video feeds of the environment. And this, you're touching on some topics on transitioning networks from existing and paralleling, but the ability to do multiple streams in the camera really gives us some tremendous advantages. Live feed for incident response, as well as having storage that you can take advantage of later. It just makes sense to be able to offer that capability to campuses. And if you think about what the cost of doing that system across multiple buildings, there's no good way to get into that from an asset perspective other than to start with a very large pot of money. you can ease into it. And just to kind of answer that question, I see these as ways to start to dip your toe in the water in this and try one camera at a time to get there. It's just a much simpler way to do it.
Another related question about the storage. Is there a limit to how many terabytes of data can be archived? Can I retain video surveillance footage for a year?
Yeah, so that's really one of the key advantages of the cloud-based approach. You don't have to figure out all your storage needs now. Whether it's number of cameras, which can vary from 10 to 1,000, depending on what you're doing, or a number of days of storage, which would go from a month to years, depending on what your data retention policies are. Either one of those can change the equation by an order of magnitude or two. So with the cloud-based system, you just tell us how many days of storage you want. And whether you've got a huge megapixel camera that's got constant motion, or you've got a little 640 by 40 camera that's pointing at a fire exit that never sees any traffic, the cloud systems charge you the same for that. So rather than thinking about terabytes or petabytes, you just think about number of cameras and number of days, and we take care of the rest. Our standard retention policy is 30 days. But for $5 per month per camera, you can for $5 per month per camera, you get an extra 30 days of storage. So you can get a year of storage for an extra $60 a month, for example.
The next question, I think it's probably addressed at Steve. Steve, can you use more than one PoE port for a camera setup?
Oh, okay. So basically, in the PoE world, there's reasons you may do this. So one of the big driver costs of deployment is the back end. So the cloud structure guys seem to have really knocked that down. The next piece is the infrastructure piece, and we've traditionally built either very complex coax systems or systems that have a hybrid of power and video transport. Now that's pre-PoE, but when you run into the PoE system, you start to run out of, you have all these extra capabilities. So your PoE system can actually drive lights. I referenced that one camera location that was a school with a darkened doorway. So if you're trying to catch someone, you may want to use infrared lighting that's not visible to the eye. But you can use PoE systems, PoE lighting from different manufacturers that is actually in the visible light range. So where you have dark spots, just as an overall security measure, you can add lighting that's powered by the Ethernet switch, which is great, especially with these LED lighting. It's a very, very efficient way to do it. So the simple answer is not on the same camera, but definitely in the same system as you're designing it.
There is a follow-up from Sridhar that I see on the, and this was to one of the earlier questions. He's saying that he already has an S3 and an Azure storage. Can I point CVR to store it to S3 or Azure?
So we have everything on our own back end, our own data centers, and we have a highly efficient storage mechanism. We borrowed an open source hardware design from a company called Backblaze, and open source solutions including Gluster and others. And when we do the math, we find that our cost of storage is much, much lower than it is for anything that Amazon offers. Because you have to pay, you can't use Glacier storage, for example. You need the storage to be online and available. And you have to pay to get the data in and out on the broadband charges, et cetera, with Amazon. Now, if someone wants to talk about a custom solution where they had some real business need to use Amazon as a storage environment, we sometimes do for very large deployments what's called a knock-in-a-box, which is essentially a copy and paste of our back end into someone else's data center. And that copy and paste could be to Amazon just as easily. But you need to have many hundreds of cameras or more before that pricing model starts to make sense again.
Steve, this one is probably for you. At what stage of the camera surveillance project should the installers get involved? What do you think of, it's probably two questions. What do you think of wireless cameras from a reliability standpoint?
So from a stage perspective, I think you can divide the installation of the cable plant into two pieces, the infrastructure and then the actual cable pulling. So you need to have those cable plant guys in early enough that they can provide guidance for costing. So if you really want to have an efficient system, and one that's well built, frankly, you want to be thinking about how you're going to travel the cable from the nearest TC or IDS out to where the camera is located. So, so the pathway component comes in early. As far as the cabling component, I think that can wait because you should already have a cabling standard, as I talked about, that's specific to your cabling needs. So that shouldn't really vary. And even on budget, you really configure budget out. I have a formula that I use, and it really holds up. So I don't even need to get cabling folks involved to the very end. On the wireless side, it depends. The wireless space. So let's define that just a little bit. So there's two types of wireless. There's regulated and non-regulated. I'm assuming what we're talking about is the regulated piece. And in the regulated piece, this is specific to FCC regulation, by the way. This is not specific to type business. But in the regulated space, you own a set of frequencies. So some campuses, especially research campuses, may own a certain frequency that they get control over. In that case, if you're using that frequency, you have control of it. Someone has control of that. And I see that heavily in airport design. The airport will own certain frequencies, right, that may sit up against Doppler radar, or they may sit up against certain spaces, and they run that on those frequencies. That's a fairly stable environment. When you start to get into the unregulated band, this is where you go down to your nearest store and buy a wireless camera, and it runs on Wi-Fi. You need to be much more careful. You need to do a frequency analysis to make sure that environment's in place. You may not want it. You may want to have air monitoring available, so you know when those frequencies are being attacked by others, because there's nothing that regulates someone from coming into that space. When someone comes into that space and starts transmitting their web surfing, your camera may be impacted. So oftentimes you're using this. Let me give some examples. You're using this because if you go across a roadway, you have to tear the roadway up. If you go across a lot, it's an archaeological site. I have that in a facility that's an outdoor botanical garden. It just makes sense to use wireless. But nothing comes for free. You need to be very, very careful how you're doing it. And with the cost of cameras, it may make sense to have more than one camera covering in the wireless environment, coming back into your environment to cover the same area, just because of the higher risk level of going wireless.
So I noticed that we're just about a minute away from the time that was allocated to us, and I do have a fairly long list of questions still coming through. But Abraham, what we're going to do is we'll just wrap up here. Maybe we'll take one more question, which is the last question that came from Sridhar, asking that we are in a regulated industry. We need vendors to be HIPAA compliant. Is your solution HIPAA compliant?
So we do a lot of HIPAA design work in hospitals across the country. It's actually the place that I started our company. I'm really familiar with that. The installation itself needs to have a BA agreement. That's not an issue. And so the installation that we do is, I'd have to check to see whether cloud structure is. But from Gauze's perspective, that's a reasonable expectation, and one that you should
okay, so we'll wrap with the last question. Our cameras come with SD storage. Can I stream straight to your cloud? Why do I need CBR boxes? Rick, maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, so if you have a whole bunch of cameras on your network, excuse me, with SD storage, they're all trying to upload at the same time, your IT department's not going to like you very much very fast. The nice thing about the CBR model is we centralize the upload requests into one channel for all the cameras, which makes it much easier for the IT department to manage us and their broadband. As I mentioned before, the overall storage cost for on-site caching, the CBR is effectively free compared to putting an SD card in every camera on site. So I think you find that using the CBR give you a lot of advantages with your IT department and would end up costing less overall.
So I guess that's probably all the questions that we can accommodate in the session for today. I do want to remind you all, and I know there were quite a few questions about that copies of this presentations and the webinar recordings will be available on our website, www.cloudastructure.com. And all the registrants as well as the attendees today should be able to get this in their inbox as well. This should happen within the next 24 hours. And before I leave you, I wanted to also remind you that if you are in the process of designing or upgrading your video surveillance systems, Cloudastructure is offering a free 2-hour workshop or a consultation session with the teams from your organization. And if you would like to take advantage of that offer, please send an email to info@cloudastructure.com. So with that, let's wrap up, and thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you again in one of our future webinars.
Thanks, everybody.